we are really grateful to be part of this strong network of Catholic campuses, and we're excited to welcome those of you who are here from non-Catholic campuses as well to join in the conversation. As we build together this network of connections across our campuses and our efforts to implement, we really strengthen efforts for all of our campuses. As we're going to ask you one more question in the chat, and that is, we'd love if you would share just what's a question or a curiosity that you are coming into this space with. We will invite those to come flowing into the chat, and Sheila's going to take a chance to look through those so that we can make sure that as we're going through today's webinar, that we are addressing those things that are pressing for you and what's bringing you to this conversation today. So feel free to reflect and share those comments. What is a question or a curiosity that you are coming into this conversation with today? Throughout our conversation today, we will obviously have a chance to hear from our incredible panelists, but we also have built in several opportunities to hear from you all. So we will have some chat questions. We will also have some polls to ask you some of the same questions that we're asking our panelists. Again, because we are highlighting these folks and the great work that they're doing, but we also want this to be an opportunity to really connect across all of the efforts that we are engaged in on our various campuses. So look for those polls. Those will be anonymous. So unlike the chat, that's a chance to share, and we will share out the answers to the extent that we can. But all of that in the polling will be anonymous for you. As we go through today, you may also have additional questions for our panelists, and we'd invite you to share those in the chat, either to everyone or directly to Sheila. Sheila, can you just sort of raise your hand in the chat or say hello in the chat so everyone can see your name and who they can direct those questions to? If you want to have an anonymous question, direct it to Sheila and she will make sure that we get it.
Yes, thank you. Please do feel free to do that. And I'm enjoying the wonderful questions that are already starting to come in. So thank you and welcome.
Great, thank you all. So now, without any delay, I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. So I'm asking each of our panelists to share their names, where they're joining us from, and also a little bit about what brought them to restorative justice and the work that they're doing. I would start with Amber, and then Amber, if you could pass from there.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Amber Monroe, I work at the University of Notre Dame. It's in South Bend, Indiana. And so in terms of what brought me to restorative justice specifically, it would be my role. I work within Title IX, currently in the Office of Institutional Equity, but 15 years before that, I worked in student affairs. And throughout that career, I was very victim offender focused in terms of reconciliation, all of those types of things. And then in 2017 at our institution, we were able to put in alternative resolution to our sexual harm response program. And so that's really, for me specifically, where we tried to begin to develop a more robust response to sexual harm as it relates to alternative resolution. And so that's where my primary focus began.
Elijah,
sorry, and I passed to Mandy. Sorry.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you so much. My name is Mandy Womack. I work at the University of San Diego, and I am one of our assistant deans, assistant dean of students. But a portion of my job, in addition to student conduct, is to coordinate our restorative justice efforts within the Division of Student Affairs. And we have been very blessed over the last couple of years to also have the Center for Restorative Justice established here at the University of San Diego by David Karp and his team. And so it really has given us just additional resources and allowed us to kind of grow and bloom the things that have happened. The first portion of my career in student affairs, though, was in fraternity and sorority life. And that is how I came to RJ. It was introduced at the university. And what I found was that as we were managing misconduct in that community, there was no closure or way to address those who had been impacted. It was had a very heavy punitive focus on the offender, take on the work that we were doing. And I thought there has to be a different way. There has to be a better way. And I think the thing that keeps me here is that, particularly in this space and time where we have the COVID pandemic and the racial pandemic, I really believe more than ever before that dialogue is the answer. So that's what keeps me here. And I will pass to Olajuwon.
Greetings, colleagues. Oh, echo, sorry. Greetings, colleagues. My name is Mccaggney. Is anyone here echo? I'm hearing an echo.
Echo. Mandy, I wonder if you mute. Sure.
Is the echo gone? Yes, wonderful. Hi, friends. My name is Mccaggney. I use he and they series pronouns. I'm coming to you from the land of the Susquehannock in Susquehanna Valley, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I am at HAC, Central Pennsylvania's Community College. And I'm in my role 6 months in. The role is quite unique in terms of I sit in academic affairs and diversity work. So I oversee a department, diversity studies, faculty partnerships, student involvement, study abroad, meta color programs, our honor society, Phi Theta Kappa, among other things. But I came to RJ in my work professionally by virtue of working at a previous institution, Nazareth College, where I was able to thread after, my training. I came hungry right after to implement restorative justice, but I've always had the restorative justice in me bug because prior to working in higher education, I used to actually work in incarceration using theater as therapy. And I was also a DJ. So fun fact about me is in my DJing abilities, my radio station, my listeners were inmates. So I would actually use restorative justice. I didn't even know I was using it, where I would talk about issues, harms, and use music, use letters, connect with the community, connect with their loved ones, and then visit them actually at the correctional facilities. So that's the way I learned about me doing the work, recognizing and restoring the harm. But I didn't have the language at the time. I was just like, this feels good. And in my current role, I don't have a current role, but my past role at Nazareth, it's just, I learned that it was a conversation we didn't have. And then now that I got the training, I can't turn it off, friends. I'm always going in a situation with this restorative lens, which, rubs people the wrong way, but I think there's beauty in the dissonance, in the disruption that it brings, because liberation's on the other side. So I think it's for instance, we'll talk about this in our session, but I think with the pandemic, COVID, or now endemic, these things, othering never went anywhere. If anything, was amplified. And how do we use it as a space and place in our roles, whether it's professionally or personally, to what restoration really looks like? And back to you, Heather.
Thank you all so much. We pulled together this group for this webinar partially from a group that engaged in an empowerment evaluation process with the Restorative Justice Network of Catholic Campuses, a group that came together over the course of four circles to really delve into questions around implementation on their own campuses, to share across campuses, and to gain a greater sense of what is needed as we as a network support the work of colleges and universities, especially Catholic institutions, in developing restorative programs and becoming more restorative broadly. As we engaged in that empowerment evaluation process, there were themes that we noticed that made us think that implementation of this work, varies across institutions, but it also varies a lot from higher ed to other spheres where restorative justice is implemented. So implementation in higher ed doesn't necessarily look like implementation in the K through 12 setting or in the criminal justice setting. And some of that is the structures of the institutions we're in. And then sort of within that, implementation is additionally unique within a Catholic setting, within our institutions that have additional layers of that Catholic identity and structure and culture. And so we're really excited to delve into that today. One theme that you will hear, at least in the questions and perhaps in the answers, is this idea that implementation at Catholic campuses and across higher ed is not linear. And often I like to say that it's sort of like gardening. There are processes that are like making your soil fertile. There are parts of implementation that are about spreading a bunch of seeds, and not all of them will grow. And then nourishing those that grow. And so with that sort of framing, I'm going to ask our panelists to share with us just what's growing on your campuses. What has grown? Where are things new and young? What does your garden look like? Amber, I'm going to start with you again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, obviously love the garden metaphor, right? Like it can be utilized in so many different ways. And, things grow at different, even if they're planted at the same time, they grow at different rates, right? And depending on how much is being watered and all of those, when we talk about resources and all of these things. And so I think within the Title IX sexual response, I think we've grown quite a bit as it relates to how we can utilize what we're calling alternative resolution that we're doing with restorative justice practice to be able to address these types of issues from harm. Where we've grown from that is working with, some of you may know Mccaggney, who's on our campus, but is done some certification through USD and those pieces. She's been a godsend as well. We are doing circles for faculty and staff as it relates to issues of concern, all of those pieces. Some of our colleagues in the Center for Social Concerns have started doing what we're calling Circle at the SNITE. And so the SNITE is our art museum. And so we're taking pieces of art that can be sparking interest of diversity, maybe harm as it relates to racial or discriminatory, sexual harm, whatever that might look like, and having some circle conversations about that. The Robinson Center is a community organization through Notre Dame. They have a student group called Take 10, who are going to be helping us develop circles as it relates to social issues on our campus. And so just those general spaces, whether that be issues of not only race and diversity and sexual harm and those pieces, but how are our underrepresented students feeling as it relates to what's happening in the rest of the world, right? And how have people been impacted by the pandemic? Are there undocumented students that experience things differently as a result of those things, the intersectionality of people's identity? And so how are we addressing these social issues? And so what I see is not only a garden, but an analogy that has always worked for me is more of these like little sparks within a forest fire, right? And so how do we make those sparks connect to create a bigger flame? And so that's really what we're trying to do. Can we get in front of the priest within our congregation, right, to be able to help them understand what this restorative justice piece is? I think specifically maybe for other Catholic campuses, but certainly ours, we've struggled with getting out of a punishment mindset. So how do we help people understand that restorative justice is accountability and all of those pieces, but it is from this other mindset, and it may not be linear. It is more web-based and all of those pieces, like trusting the process. And I'm a process person, so I think from A to B to C. And so it's been challenging even for me as a practitioner to kind of trust the process and to have those conversations. And when you talk about gardening, like gardening my own heart, like you have to show up in these spaces ready for those things where, yes, you always want to be in that state, but you get found out a lot faster in this kind of situation as it relates to helping people through their harm, as opposed to maybe facilitating a process in that way. And so I think that there's a lot of gardening happening. We're trying to recruit more gardeners, but in that way, we're really trying to get it sparking. So to have it more of a conversation, changing narrative, creating similar language that people can use so people understand what we're talking about. So that when we say a word as it relates to restorative justice, we're all talking about the same thing. So yeah, I do appreciate the gardening analogy, but I personally also use the sparks and the fires. So, and invite whomever would like to go next.
I am happy to go next. So here at the University of San Diego, we actually have been able to grow and expand some things due to the nature of the pandemic and having to shift some of our traditionally in-person programming and needing to find it another way. So one of those was looking at designed around community building, but doing orientation circles for our newest students onboarding in groups of 8, looking at 1,500 students required a lot of volunteers and a lot of people who were willing to learn about what RJ meant, learn about what it meant to be developing community in that context, and being able to have those while community building focused with an emphasis on DEI and belonging for one, and our wellness resources for another. We also have found a lot of popularity, and my student conduct friends will understand, with alcohol impact circles. So students who have a first-time alcohol violation participating in a circle with a group and facilitators to be able to kind of make sense and reflect upon kind of what had happened and how they want to develop community aside from that. And then finally, really this emphasis on being able to be responsive to current events as they're happening. And one of the things, and I would range current events from global to even on campus, like issues based. And I think some of our challenge had been being able to be prepared and nimble enough to be timely in that response. And so we have been working with a group with our strategic committee to really prep ourselves for the things that we know are going to be impactful and need that emphasis. We have a pretty strong team on that strategic committee, some of whom are on this call today, and who are often also tapped by different university resource folks. So recently, a colleague was sharing with me that he partnered with our human resources area to develop a circle for brand new employees, and that was warmly welcomed and really a chance for people to connect at a different level. And then, of course, as I mentioned in our introduction, our Center for Restorative Justice was able to advocate and partner for 30 people across the campus to receive a training on kind of why restorative justice matters and how they can utilize that in their day-to-day work. And so I think a lot of seeds have been planted, and the growing, I think, is beginning. So.
To follow Mandy with the analogy of a lot of seeds being planted, for me, my notion is how do I cultivate our inner arborists at our institutions? Because I think part of the landscape is you want to see if the foundation is good. And if the foundation is good, how do you plant these trees for the roots? Because once the roots are there, it's difficult to uproot the behavior. So for me, it's what was growing at my previous institution is that in my previous role, if you think about the sort of the tiered approach, the 3 tiers, I really focused on tier 1 and tier 2. Versus in my current role, I'm really focusing on tier 3. They haven't got to tier 2 and 1 yet, but there's no reason, there's no really no method in going in order. It makes sense for your institution. But for my previous role, that meant using restorative justice as part of RA training. So we moved away from floor meetings to community building circles. We moved towards having residents create community norms for their areas so that every floor had a community norm. We took all the norms. So say there was a living, learning community comprised of a building that had 5 floors. Each floor would have 5 floors of community norms. Outside of the main building was all the community norms for the building. So that folks, when they entered the space, they were aware of the community they were entering. When they went to each subfloor, they got that community's norms. So there was ways that we infiltrated it that way. We infiltrated it with, creating our bias response education team and having RJ show up through there. We threaded it through our co-curricular transcript. So I created a student leadership program called Roots. Roots stood for Reconsidering Othering and Oppression Through Systems. So it was a training that I created. I made a whole manual, and then they got great swag, and they were basically my Roots ambassadors. So they would do RJ circles for student government, for programs, for Res Life, whatever, or there were peer support if we had a conduct issue and they wanted peer representation. So I think those are the ways that we sort of grew it that way. And one of the things that I thrived in, or became my specialty of sorts, is using RJ to tackle identity-based harm. So using ways to recognize, reconcile the spiritual, emotional harm caused by othering. And then particularly working with students of color to navigate racism, to navigate, the other isms and schisms. In my new role, it's more academic in terms of I think about reentry a lot. So when we were I was at a college where mask policy, whatnot, vaccination, I always talked about what's the harm we're causing by going towards this fashion. You're gonna other somebody. My current role is I said, okay, how have we prepared people to people back in a pandemic? What does reentry look like? I think about reentry when you think about leave of absence. So I asked my faculty, I say, so when a student do an LOA, what's reentry look like? What are you talking about? I said, what's the game plan? Because harm is happening. The harm is relational. They're no longer part of our community. How are we bringing them back into the fold? Who are their systems of support? So that's my goal, my current role is that, and using RJ for faculty and staff grievances. So managing from there. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few questions. So back to Heather.
Thank you so much, Olajman. And we are going to turn the proverbial camera around to our participants for a minute now and ask a polling question. We want to hear from you all. What's growing where you are? So we'll see that poll come up. You all can go ahead and engage with that as we hear from the panelists over the next question, and we'll be able to share responses at the next pause. Olajman, you started by talking about nourishing folks' inner arborist and this sort of transformation that's necessary even in order to create programs. I'm wondering from all of you, what do you see as the individual and collective transformation that needs to happen for RJ implementation efforts to really be successful? And since you I'm going to pass to Mandy so you can have a chance to breathe, Elijah.
Oh, that's fine. I'm good. I'm good. You can go right in. So your question was,
what's the
individual and collective transformation that's needed for RJ implementation?
Mm-hmm.
I think twofold is that folks forget, I think about leadership theories. Folks forget that there's leadership development and leader development, two different concepts. Both require nurturing. And then both forget that leadership is individual and collective. And I think the individual transformation that's required to implement RJ requires, to me, in my work, is soul surgery. You have to do those incisions within to expose how you are complicit to the narrative, the dominant narratives, whether it's ableism, genderism, patriarchy. How are you complicit? How are you benefiting from access that creates inequitable outcomes for the folks that are in our community? Once you recognize that that dissonance, how do you move through it? So I think there's an individual transformation that's required, but also, what are you holding hostage? So I think about when I work with students, identity-based harm, it's like, I'll hear their stories and I'm like, so why are you tethered to trauma? Everyone's tethered to trauma. And then I think once you expose what's keeping you from healing, because if you're an unhealed being, how are you doing this RJ work? So you have to do the transformation within. And I think the collective transformation requires, how do you rewrite the institution's DNA? So how do you do, I think, like, Jane Elliott, blue eyes, brown eyes, think about DNA, how it works. There's dominant and recessive traits. So at your institution, ask yourself, institution, is othering a dominant or recessive trait? Can RJ be a dominant trait? And then what's required for us to rewrite our DNA? So that collective transformation is, we can't just fixate on the climate, the mood, the feeling, and lose sight of we're not changing the culture. And part of the cultural shift is acknowledging how institutionally we were complicit to harm. So whether that's beyond, you think about the decolonization and anti-racism, think about oppression in general. What is the legacy of oppression at the institution that we have not reconciled? And we think that it's just race or ability. No, think deeper. Put yourself in the minds and hearts of every community member. So think faculty. Is it equitable in tenure process? Think about the cultural minority tax that implied for those minoritized faculty when it comes to service for the institution. So think about the legacies of erasure when it comes to, I think about a community college. How do you put the community back in community college? So think about those things that you're complicit to, and then that's how you transform. And with that, I will toss over to Mandy.
Perfect. Thank you. Echo all of the things that were shared. For me, a lot of our transformation, I think, needs to focus around our community really understanding our mission and our values as a Catholic institution, and the automatic connection that happens when we talk about care for one another, and when we talk about living in community and the interdependence that comes from that. And as I think people struggle with what that looks like in their day-to-day work, they will continue to struggle with how restorative justice can be implemented in every single aspect of what they do. And so I know we have he's on the call, so I'll say fantastic new vice president for mission integration. And I'm hopeful that in the midst of this transition, that this is really something that the campus, that it goes to as a first thought. And I think that is also a heart and a soul transformation, right? Rather than being reactionary or having, like a strategic response driving, what is the thing that is going to heal and address those impacts that are happening? And I think that goes hand in glove with our mission and our values as a Catholic institution. And I will pass to Amber.
Yes, thank you. I think I fully agree with Olajuwon in terms of, having to do your own work, and then how do we challenge people to do that. I think one of the ways that we are doing that is to try to create tools and templates to help faculty and staff and students develop skills to be able to do that. I think that people don't have skills to deal with difficult people and situations. And so like, how are we helping people respond to that? But I think more broadly in terms of a transformation for our campus, how are we creating space for voices to be heard? Are there voices that have not been heard, have been ignored, have been silenced? How are we bringing restitution for that, for institutional harms that may have happened, whether that's murals in our main building that may misrepresent Indigenous people? How are we responding to things that have happened in the past and acknowledging those? Because I think that it's difficult to move forward until and unless those things happen. And so being able to have conversations with people who are in positions of power to be able to impact those things, who are extremely open and receptive. Understanding, I think that it's we talked about the gardening and the setting the fires. It's having those successes, but then how do you tell the story of those successes, right? And so when I do something for a staff RJ response, how am I letting my supervisor know to let her supervisor know? How are these things getting more broadly distributed, so additional resources, so people see this as a way to address harm, to not only address harm that's occurred, but then how do we again equip people to prevent harm from happening, right? And that's our goal. And some of you may be Green Dot campuses as well. Green Dot's something that we've had on campus for 7 years now, and so really starting to see a lot of those cultural shifts as we have that critical mass and those pieces. So like, how do we kind of not model that exactly, but use that as a guiding force in terms of like, how do we create change in these different areas? And, all of us, think back to Fred Rogers and like, find the helpers. Where are the helpers in this area? And how do we connect them to this work and get them trained and equipped? Because you can be passionate, but this is, as a professional, this is probably the thing that I do. I think Mandy might have said something about this earlier. Like, I do feel like this is a magic pill. Like it is, I love just watching the process and then people are healed and through it. But you need to be able to be trained to do it well. And then where are we getting that practice? How are we shadowing? Where are we providing opportunities like this? Either more broad or just on your campus to encourage and fuel the, fan the flames for the people who do have a passion for this.
Thank you, Amber. And all of you, I think we're getting a rich picture of how broad this work is. And to that end, Sheila, if you are ready to share the poll, our last poll, remember this is about where is RJ growing on your campus? And so we know that student affairs encompasses some of these other answers, but CC conduct, but there's also a lot of RJ growing within academic departments, within mission and ministry work, within student activities. And I think as we've heard from our panelists, there's growth even beyond that. There are opportunities really in every corner, and that's going to look different on our different campuses. So thank you all for sharing. I will also make a call out that the third in these webinar series will be focused on connecting with mission and ministry. And so a great opportunity to continue that conversation. Panelists, I'd love to turn now a little bit more to the how and just I think a lot of the questions we saw coming in were just, one I loved was, how are people doing it? And I think that's at the root here. What for you have been some of the most helpful things in amplifying restorative justice implementation on your campus? We'll start, Mandy, can we start with you on this one?
Sure. So I think that for me, it has been around how do I position what we're doing to fit within the context of what is needed? Because often our work is involving other campus partners. And so, maybe it's just on my campus, but folks are tired. like people are really worn out. And so how can this lens or this perspective or, our committee help support the work that's happening in residential life, in onboarding, in our multicultural center? Like how can these things support that? And so it's seen really as a resource and an add-on to the work that's already being done, and a support rather than more tasks that we're asking other people to do. The other thing that we've really tried to utilize this year, excuse me, is really looking at small opportunities to be involved. Would you be willing to be trained and lead a circle? 90-minute commitment. I mean, the training is longer, of course, and so people feel able to say yes to 90 minutes, but not yes to like, I would love to be, giving you 15 hours a month and so being able to be very clear about what we're asking and what that will take from someone, I think really has been important, as California, particularly USD, has been, I think, among the last to like come back fully on board and with all of the COVID responses. And so I think people are so upended that they need those boundaries and those parameters.
Mandy, can I ask you to follow up? You mentioned a committee in your answer. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of who's the we in what you're sharing?
Yeah. So we were very fortunate that our former vice president, and it is continuing with the new one, thankfully, reallocated 10% of 5 different people's professional job to work on restorative justice. And so that strategic committee are professionals from our 5 different kind of identified areas, or like Dean of Students is one, our auxiliary services is one, whatever your campus calls those. And that group really is kind of like our think tank and our sounding board for here's what we're doing. What ideas do people have for scripts? What sort of things do we want to focus our energy on? Who wants to go and meet with the Dean of Students about this being our response to bias incidents, and really just being able to utilize those skills and talents, and then having it be a part of people's job so that it's not an add-on for them. I mean, it is an add-on, but it is within the scope of what they're doing rather than just something they're doing because they're interested and want to volunteer.
Thanks for that rich detail, Mandy. I am just going to announce to the group that we're going to go ahead and open another poll as we listen to Amber and Elijah. And this poll is basically asking the same question of you all. What has helped your campus's restorative justice implementation to succeed? And I'll note that if these 3 answers don't quite capture it for you, if there are other forms of support, please share those in the chat, and we'll loop back to this after we hear from our other 2 panelists. Amber, Elijah, who wants to jump in?
I'll go ahead because I was already unmuted. So with the implementation, I think that it really has been, how do we make it accessible and easy for people to kind of jump on board? And so that might look like developing some skills that we are giving to managers, that have a hard job of like managing maybe our service industry where there's a lot of conflict that might arise, and those kinds of pieces. How do we make sure that we're giving them cultural sensitivity training as well? And how do you just have this bucket of tools? I always say that a tool is to help us serve others and not to serve the tool. And so I do see that RJ is a tool, but I do think it's one of the more effective ways in which we can assist people. And so how are we making that accessible? And again, I think that we've talked about like, how are we networking it? How are we getting it in front of people? How are we making it valuable? And so the implementation on our campus has been a lot of how do we tell our story? story? Where are the pockets, and how are we making sure that we are all in the same room and in the same space? So we have our own little Notre Dame RJNCC, right? And so we have people from various parts of the campus that get together who are interested in doing this work. And, we have different facets where people, for example, I mentioned the Snite Museum piece and some of the Take 10 RJ social circles, or the work that they're doing in student affairs within the residence halls and training the RAs and other response student staff, and obviously the work that I do within Title IX and the Office of Institutional Equity as it relates to other forms of discrimination. So it really is, how do we make it, again, effective, easy, and accessible for people, and to, at this point, not make it like mandatory, but it really appealing as an option. Like, oh, you have this issue, I have this thing that's very helpful for you, right? Like, it's something that benefits you to have this in your space, in your program, in your department, in your toolkit. And so we want to be helpful in that way. And so I think that we found that to be effective. Now I invite Olajuwon.
Thank you, Amber. I think for me, in the beginning of my RJ journey at my institution, I never introduced the language. So I think linguistics and rhetoric is access. So I never said I was doing RJ. I literally just started going into meetings and implementing the 5 C's. I changed my staff meetings, asked my supervisor to say, here's what I'm thinking. Going into spaces with student government and leaders, here's what I'm thinking. Creating space for the community to create the narrative. And then when I got good feedback, I said, what if I told you the last 6 weeks what you've been doing was restorative justice? What? We were. I think so. My philosophy is that, one, you got to meet people where they are. So like, I went in there, you can't go in there with like a 10-gallon capacity for restorative justice, and you have a colleague with a pint-sized capacity. Expecting them to be 10 gallons. Sometimes they don't want 10 gallons. They don't even want a quart. That's all they have the capacity to take. So once I understood the language navigation, I spoke the language of the people. So rather than thinking restorative justice, something I added to folks' plate, I did a lot of digging and reframed how RJ was already showing up in their role. I said, you're already doing the work. Here's some examples, huh? I was like, all you gotta do. So I did a lot of reframing for folks to reconsider RJ. And then I leveraged the folks that were able to do the work, air quotes. So at the time, I didn't have the capacity for administration at the time, but in my opinion, it's administration. I say go where the students are, because students impact administration. So I poured into students. I built up their capacity. I started with doing these melanated and mindfulness retreats. It was only for BIPOC only students. And I used RJ to do race-based healing. Then I started doing it for our students that experience disability erasure. And it was like, we want more of this. I'm like, well, I don't have a budget or anything, so advocate for me. So it became this ripple effect where students were requesting me to come to department meetings to do RJ conversations. And then once the faculty realized, like we had one situation where we had this theater department do a lot of othering. And I asked to do an RJ style, and I don't recommend this unless you have the skill set and finesse. I did an RJ session, virtual and in person, with moderators that I ended up training with the student. And the faculty felt so empowered to be in community with the students. They thought that they were going to get in trouble. They thought the students were going to expose all the issues, but instead they realized they were harmed too. And we worked together to reconcile. So I think once you figure out where the hurt is happening, try to mend it. And then in the mending, folks feel empowered to have agency to say, now that I'm healed, how can I show up for you? And with that, I bring it back to Heather.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to share the poll, but I also just want to let some of these reflections sink in from our panelists. So you'll see in our poll that folks who are participating have engaged in cross-departmental collaborations, worked with really supportive senior administrators, and really worked on connecting restorative justice and mission. We also had a great suggestion shared in the chat about writing into job descriptions RJ work as a strategy for amplifying and growing this work. I want to ask now the sort of opposite question. What's been hard? What are obstacles that you have encountered in growing RJ on your campus? And what advice would you give to colleagues around those types of obstacles? And just to sort of seed your thinking, some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat touch on some challenges like access to resources for implementation, integrating restorative justice into really busy, full schedules, staff turnover, getting buy-in from senior administration, building coalition building. So just to have those in mind as you think about the challenges that you all have faced. Amber, can we send this one to you first?
Yeah, happy to. And so I think some of the biggest challenges that we've hit is really with helping people understand what it is and what it isn't. And so again, I think I alluded to earlier that we have had like maybe more of a punishment mentality as it relates to harm. And so how do we refocus and pivot that? I think of a RJ training that we did, I think it was summer of 2018, where we had about 30 people from not only our campus, but the community. The South Bend community, incidentally, is much further along in terms of restorative justice in their school systems and those pieces than we are on our campus. And so like, how are we trying to partner there as well? But even within the role plays, like we couldn't get out of like the accountability having to be punishment, right? And so even those switching those kinds of mindsets, and that to understand that RJ is absolutely accountability, but it's in a way that is actually restorative and reparative, and helping them. And again, what Olajuwon had said earlier in terms of helping them understand, like there's parts of this that you're already doing. Like, how are we connecting, especially to the Catholic mission, to our mission here, specifically at the University of Notre Dame? There's so many components. Like, this should not be hard. It really shouldn't. It really is who we are. It's very aspirational to who we want to be. It's not always who we are in every situation. And so first of all, acknowledging that, right? And the ways in which we can and must do better. And how are we, again, providing space to give people voice, to be able to speak to those things. And so I think that those are some of the major challenges. I think sometimes just being a Catholic institution in the Midwest as it relates to especially like sexual harm in the space that I work in, right? There's some different nuances there that make it very challenging. And how is this appropriate for these kinds of harm? And then, making helping people understand that it can be extremely not only appropriate, but even more effective for both parties and participants. So I think that those are some of the major kind of obstacles that seemingly kind of pop up. It's not like, oh, we, got this over this hill, but it's more of like a hill that goes like this, where, oh, well, we have to have that same conversation over here, or this same challenge in this area now. And so Obviously everyone's tried to do culture change on their campus, and so it's can be slow going, but to really be able to celebrate the successes, I think has been helpful. And so I'd like to pass to Olajuwon.
Thank you, Amber. I think some of the challenges that I faced in my previous role, one, it was, Elijah, we don't have the time. And I'm like, well, time is relative. It's also spatial and temporal. So time, it's a social construct, in my opinion. But it's a reality. So what I did in my previous role was that I worked with colleagues to break up time. And I said, there's two types of change: evolutionary and revolutionary change. Evolutionary change takes time. So usually we know in higher ed, if you're a 4-year institution, it takes 5 years to cycle through something. That's evolutionary change. Revolutionary change is what you can do the next hour, what you can do next week, what you can do next semester. That incremental change creates evolutionary change. So when you break it up into small bite-sized pieces, it becomes more palatable. And letting folks know that you're not going to have to solve the world's problems with RJ, one. Number two, find your first pocket. So if your goal is to have a bias response team, can you start out with like a club, a group, a convening, connecting, collaborator group, and then work your way up towards that, if that's your zenith. And knowing that your zenith can be anything. So I think it's just also acknowledging the fact that how are you, another obstacle was that, what about accountability? How are we going to make folks accountable? And my philosophy or my mantra is that we repeat what we don't repair. So again, we repeat what we don't repair. So I would go back and look at the data and say, here's the data, here are the climate surveys. We repeat what we're not repairing. So that gives us the fuel to repair the issues. So when people say, so the accountability could be something as simple as, in my previous role, I worked with HR so that a part of performance appraisals had a belonging D&I element, that folks were required to do some sort of professional learning opportunity. I always had an RJ session lined up for folks to choose from. So you create waves of access points that RJ infiltrates, that holds folks accountable to a narrative. And you start off with like, the issue is, if it's cabinet, bring someone in. We all know how higher ed works. Sometimes you need someone else outside of your institution to say the same exact thing you are to say. So how are you leveraging best practices and say, hey, I want to bring in someone who done at their institution, plant the seed. My last institution, I made a part of the common read. I made folks read a book in cabinet, brought it in. My supervisor said, come in, do these workshops and build capacity. And I was able to work with cabinet to expose where there were building blocks and barriers to belonging that RJ could benefit in restoring the harm. And once financial aid folks said, oh, I didn't know we're a barrier in financial aid due to X, Y, Z. I didn't know we were a barrier in access when it came to how accessible our content is on the website. Once folks figure out how they're complicit to the harm, they want to immediately rectify. And your obstacle becomes, alleviated, because you're using them and you're exposing their own, how they show up to the narrative, and gives them the ability to rewrite that narrative or, change it. And then last but not least, Mandy.
Thanks. It's such good things shared already. I also hear a lot from folks around time. And one of the things that I often wonder is, if we don't have time to do it right, can we really afford not to spend that time when that's the limitation that's offered? I would also add that I think that sometimes disguised as time is also fear, that we know what works, whether it's right or wrong, we know what works. And so the thought of trying something different really creates a lot of fear and anxiety in people. And Catherine had offered earlier in the chat that mental health issues are a great concern. I think particularly when we're serving our students, I think that the student needs, because those needs are skyrocketing, it's creating an additional layer of fear amongst the faculty and staff that support them, because people feel out of their depths. So how do we, what we've tried to do, I think sometimes more successfully than others, is create this core group of intentional partners that can kind of acknowledge and address and own that fear is happening, and offer kind of the possibility, like what could, maybe this isn't going to work, but maybe it's going to be great. And so to have those partners there, really to kind of combat that obstacle, because I can't be in every conversation. You can't be in every conversation. So how do we get other people that can kind of name what's happening when it's showing up as fear, and then allow us to move forward, even if it's incrementally. And I will pass back to Heather.
Thank you, Mandy. Thanks for naming that. The fear is real there for all of us in our various roles. I want to do a couple things. So we're going to post another poll, and this is a chance to hear from our participants about what are obstacles that you are encountering. And so go ahead and start completing that. And while they do that, I'm going off script here, folks. So stick with me. I want to do a little bit of sort of rapid fire, some of the nitty gritty questions that we've gotten in the chat about implementation. And so all three of you don't need to answer, but we'll do some just brief answers to these nitty gritty questions. So one was about, how do you maintain momentum with staff turnover?
For me, is that we lose sight of, I think when you're in your roles of like, who's your historian? So we need to, I think that's harm. History and lack of history is harm, because you don't have a barometer of success or where you went. So I think part of that is to help. Turnover is going to happen. People are going to figure out ways to reconcile their peace, and they leave. You can't deal with that. But what you can deal with is creating check-in measures, so that way when folks are looking to depart, you have ways to collect information. So whether that's in roles, manuals, or handbooks, or notes, any kind of data, but also how are you telling the story of your brand, of your office, of your institution, or your area? What is the legacy that you want to leave when that person departs? That's something I ask my team when I hire a new staff member. I'm like, what legacy do you want to leave? How are folks going to know you were here 4 or 5 years from now? What can I operationalize on your behalf? So if folks feel like it's outside of them, I think that helps mitigate the issue of staff are going to leave. But if you can create mechanisms that you collect the information and safeguard it, flash drives, I'm old school, physical. I like a good binder, highlighted, dated, done by the years and the month, and I can just pinpoint where I need to show up. It's sort of my like legend and key system. But I'll invite my other colleagues.
Well, I would say in addition to that point, also helping people understand that this is beneficial for retention, right? Like there was a situation where we did a circle because somebody was actually leaving the institution, and I was a little heartbroken that, like, had we known about this earlier, had they utilized us as a resource, maybe that person would have chosen to stay, right? But thankfully, still willing to participate and, moved on, but moved on in a better way for everyone, right? They felt better about the situation. So did the people that were remaining here. And so just helping people understand that it's a very effective retention tool as well. As it relates, we know that people leave because of bad work environments or managers or whatever those pieces are, coworkers that they can't seemingly get along with, or whatever that looks like. Something that might be a hostile environment but doesn't rise to the level, something is actionable, right? Like, so how do we just, again, develop this as a skill set? Because we all have to live with other humans, right? And it's a human condition that we will experience harm and cause harm. And so, like, how do we create an environment in which skills can be accessible for people to navigate those things more broadly?
Mandy, do you want to add anything about staff turnover, or should I throw another question at y'all?
Let's throw another one out. I think those were both really great answers.
Okay. So another rapid one, logistics. How do you work on this getting buy-in from administration, from senior administration? What's helpful there?
I will kick us off. I really appreciated the example that Olajuwon shared of, like, do you know what we've been doing? I have not tried that myself, but we have invited people into conversations in like a circle format. And it is amazing once someone has that experience, how much more open they are to the rest of the conversation. So how I would look for ways to be able to incorporate some of those principles and practices in things that are already happening, so that people feel, so it doesn't feel so out of the norm or so, so difficult to put your arms around that you don't want to try it.
Anyone else want to comment on getting buy-in from senior administration?
I think it all depends on your locus of control, because we got to respect, even though I don't agree, positionality. So if you are not in the position of access, it can seem off-putting to show up to cabinet or administration and say, here's what I decree. But there could be entry or access points. For instance, if you have a student government association, most of them are set up in a way that the president of SGA has access to the president. That could be an entry point. Most of us sit on committees that are chaired by someone of authority. There's an access point. So you find other ways to access. It's almost like a telegram. And you're sending the message up if you cannot access the channel directly. But if you do have access to the channel directly, then you use the data. You use your mission statement. You use your strategic plan to say, I'm calling you in, that this is everyone's responsibility, including leadership. And if we really want to make this part of our DNA, folks need to see you embodying the work. But don't fray. We got you. We're going to build capacity together and do your own, and allow them to do their own work as you do the work on behalf of the institution.
Can I add one more quick thing to that? So when we really began implementing some of these larger, like, campus-wide initiatives, one of the things that we incorporated into training and into our strategic committee group is, I want folks at all times to have 2 comments about something that's working really well in their back pocket, so that when you run into the dean in the hall and they're like, how's it going? That you have that story to tell. Because it can't just be me, or it just can't be me and Sean. Like, it has to be this broader experience, or to be able to tell, the school of business dean, hey, one of your faculty was fantastic in this setting. And let me tell you about what, it was so great. I meant to send you an email. Let me just tell you real quick. And so to have those talking points just at the ready are really, and we ask our volunteers to do that and to share those stories up.
Great suggestions. Thanks. I'm going to throw one more at you all, and then we'll take a look at the poll. This one, Mandy touched on a bit, the committee that you all have at the University of San Diego and how that's structured with folks' time allocation. I'm wondering, from Amber and Olajuwon, what does coalition building look like? What are the groups that are gathering, or just what's the shape of that for your campus or your work?
I think for me, it's just that, how you discern in your restorative justice sort of building capacities that you're not othering in the process. So sometimes we want to invite people at the table and realize, is a table even necessary? Or who is on the actual menu? And who's in the back of the house, who's in the front of the house? Where is this table located? Upstairs, downstairs, down the street? So I think part of it is that who are we choosing to grant access to the space that we hope to create to liberate our students? So are we actually gatekeeping or are we gate opening? So I think we have to discern that when we want a coalition build. And then what is our end goal in the coalition building? Because sometimes we go under the guise of liberating ourselves, and liberation is not about us. Because sometimes we are not the most vulnerable. And that's a tough pill to swallow for people when you want a coalition build with, because they go in there thinking that here's the harm that I experienced, here's what I want to advocate for. It's not about you. It's about the most vulnerable, which may not include you. So I think it's reframing who shows up, how they're invited to that space, and making sure that the invitation is always open. And that this work can happen in community. So there's inter-community and intra-community engagement. So this work can happen on a Zoom. This work can happen asynchronously. It can happen in person. And it doesn't have to be the same people doing the work in each one of those groups. One group, that's how I did in my last institution, is that we had this interdivisional, like the VPs and the AVPs, we all came together and we did the work. And then we brought it back to our teams and we reported back. And then we had our teams meet on their own doing reading books. And we had another, so there's ways that you create the coalitions throughout, but you may not be the one that's necessary to lead each aspect of the coalition as it's being built.
Yeah, and I wish that I could say I was as intentional as that, but that's ours was more haphazard, right? And in terms of just kind of organically, I, again, because of the position that I was in and the resources, being able to do alternative resolution with sexual harm response, had this area, and then there are other people who had areas of interest that were working on doing restorative work in their areas. Many of you are most likely familiar with Susan Sharp, who is just a treasure, who was here at Notre Dame until she retired in May of 19, I believe. And so being able to work with her and glean from the decades of work that she has done. And so just really trying to build on some of that momentum, and it's really ebbed and flowed. And so I feel like we're at a position now where we can start being more intentional and asking some of those questions, but it really has just been more organic in terms of who's interested, who's committed, who has capacity. I think that's been a big part, right? In terms of Title IX work, that's a lot. And so wanting to develop the restorative justice piece, and what capacity do I have to do that for an institution? And so having everyone else come along as well. And so really, I think it goes back to the open invitation that you had talked about, Olajuwon, and just making sure that everyone knows that they're invited and not assuming that everyone knows. Like, how are we showing that this is for everyone, and especially those who feel harmed and underrepresented, especially people who may have experienced institutional harm or individual, whatever that might look like, but that there is a place to come, and that there are resources available. And some of those resources include skill building through a restorative justice process.
Thank you, Amber. And I think it's so interesting to see the different shapes depending on your institutions, depending on who's starting the ball rolling, how these look differently for all of us. Sheila is going to share our poll now, and we have an obvious winner in lack of time for implementation. I'm going to send this back to our panelists. Panelists, first of all, I'm going to just ask you, how much free time do you have in your job, in your work? And then,
what is the operational definition of free?
Juan, good question. I'll let you dig into that in your response. And then just how do you frame thinking about implementation, growing RJ in the midst of lack of time? I'll let you jump in whatever order inspires you.
I will say that I think Mandy may have alluded to this earlier in terms of the pandemic actually being helpful in this arena in some sense. And I personally have found that with being able to pivot some of those things, with students not being on campus, they weren't in spaces to harm each other as much, perhaps. And so being able to, and then also I have an extremely supportive supervisor who is really, she sees the value. She's gotten her upper administration on board as well. And so feeling like this is an area that we do need to develop. And so being able to not only send me to trainings, but making sure that other people have the, again, that skill set. But I think that being able to offload and be very transparent with her about where I would like to be spending my time, as opposed to really not only what I like to do, but this is really what our campus needs, and seeing the value. That's not something that I think I'm blessed to have a woman who sees that, but I think that that's been instrumental for me personally as it relates to this work, and being able to pivot some of that, because we haven't gotten very far because of the capacity of myself and others who are just kind of doing it when we had time, which is hardly ever. So
I say for me, I reframed time and reclaimed it. So I mentioned this to Heather and Sheila at one point, is that I had a previous cabinet member, I explained my work and how the work I had to do and the time I didn't have. And they basically said, Elijah, it sounds like you're burned out. And I said, I'm not. I'm just being exploited, because burnout means it's about me. Exploitation is about the institution taking my talents and not recognizing the fact that I need a break. So when I quit or resign, you make it look as if he was tired, but the behavior in the culture still remains. So one, I reclaim my time. Two, I've learned to stop tying value to my availability. Just because I'm available doesn't mean I'm valuable. Just because I'm valuable doesn't mean I have to be available. So part of that is, in taking back my time, I just reframe how I show up moving forward. So in how I show up moving forward is, I can't liberate students or faculty staff, but I'll liberate myself. So in that liberation, I seek to control what I can control in terms of how I show up, because you can't save the institution, not our job. And who said it needs saving? Maybe some rescuing. Maybe it just needs to open up its third eye. But we got to disrupt that notion of saving the space, because at the end of the day, how higher ed works is like, you can unfortunately die on top of that hill. And then how higher ed works is they will post your job next week. So I live in the fact that I can't change or fix everything, but what I can do is create a ripple. Is in that ripple, if someone chooses to stay in that current with me, let's ride it together. So I think that's how I choose to embrace time, and not having the time to do everything.
I don't know if there's a better answer to follow that. So I will
I was just thinking, when does your book come out, or did I already miss it?
I think we all need to just breathe in some of that reflection. And I think, to our colleagues who are on this call, I want to just affirm that, whether it's just in the poll or what you're hearing from these panelists, we're all with you in this feeling of time not very time affluent at the moment, and we're and that comes with it a lot of feelings about how we're doing our work. And I think what we see in this panel and in examples from all of you throughout the network is that this work can grow, but it doesn't need to be you pushing a boulder up a hill. It can be you finding the seed that is right there that you want to help blossom. And I will say, with my gardening metaphor, that you can also be my houseplant that I forgot to water for 2 months, and then I watered it, and it did come back, And that those 2 months were lost, and that's what it is, and it lost some leaves, but it's still alive, and that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
As we draw to a close, I so appreciate our participants sharing questions throughout, and we've tried to weave those in. So we're not going to have a sort of set Q&A time, but keep those questions coming. Want to pivot a little bit to thinking about the network that exists between us. We've talked a lot about our individual works on our campuses, but the network that we have, and love to hear from you all here on this panel about what does it look like, whether it's within your campus or as a network, the Restorative Justice Network of Catholic Campuses or other professional networks, to provide support for campus RJ practitioners to develop themselves further or to develop their work further. And if you have examples of ways that you've received support through networks, throw those in as well. Mandy, you're off mute, so I'm calling on you.
Perfect. The thing that comes to mind immediately is I received an email at the end of last week from a colleague that I've never met in person, a practitioner, and they had what I think was maybe started out as a more technical question of how our campus uses the Maxiant database system to track RJ. And so we got on a Zoom today, and all of us, and he's asking me for how are you using this? What's working? And all of a sudden, this whole new idea of how we can be better utilizing the system on my campus emerged. And so here, he's coming to me for help, and I'm walking away with the better idea. And I think that for me, it's opening yourself to those possibilities and just making the time, forcing, and back to time again, but saying I can give you a half an hour, because I wouldn't have spent half an hour thinking about how this management system could make my work more effective or more long-term, or get more buy-in from other people. But in that space, that also occurred. So I think it's reaching out, being responsive if you're the one that people are reaching out to, and then just being open to the fact that all of us are always learning.
I think to Mandy's point is that you have to, in order to lead inward, you have to lean outward. And I think about when I joined the RJNCC, is as soon as I went to that training, I connected with folks. I still connect with colleagues, that you need this sort of brave space network association to ping pong ideas. You need dissonance coaches. You need affirmation partners to create that space, but you also need folks that have made momentum in other ways that you could not, to think about it differently. So I think, are you maximizing and leveraging this space? So someone said, I need a large monumental ripple. And I said in the chat, this space is your ripple. But some of you are choosing just to continue to skip rocks and realizing that there's some stillness in the pond here. So how are you leveraging this space, friends?
Amber, before you share, I'm just going to ask Sheila to post the next poll, which is about what kind of support can the RJNCC offer to you and your campus. So as folks marinate on that and give us some answers, I'll pass the mic back to Amber.
Yeah, and I'll echo one of the choices there is partnering with other campuses, and I have personally found that most valuable. I know that there's some campuses just even in our area who have created some pretty high level restorative justice positions even, and so being able to model, connect with them to understand like how did you get this? What was the path? What was the obstacles? What are the transferable things that we can glean from that path and that experience? And I think that both the blessing and frustration in this kind of work is that it is not linear, right? And it's can be very campus specific as it relates to how it's being built. And so being able to understand other people's stories and then how is that retrofitted to your campus. And so being able to maybe get with like-minded institutions as it relates to that RJNCC piece. But even within that, there's obviously diversity. And so being able to help people like who are the key people and why was that key for you? And so it might not be those same people, but the rationale might be similar that I can apply to this other set of people. And so what are those transferable things? And so I know that especially the folks at USD and all of the RJNCC network has been invaluable for being able to advance the work that we're doing on our campus.
And the RJNCC is really eager to hear more. So this poll is one way, but as you think about what kind of support would be most helpful for you, we as a network want to be supporting each other, and so please do reach out individually. I think Mandy gave a great example of we all love those out of the blue emails of like, hey, can we hop on a call and have a quick conversation with colleagues across the country, and then reaching out to the center at USD as a sort of hub in our network is another great way to connect with opportunities and to share ideas.